NPR just provides content, and I would say that at the most, stations carry Morning Edition and All Things Considered. And so when I get complaints about NPR, I say, okay, that's fine. I'll take that complaint, but please, and with the threat that they will no longer donate, I say, I try to explain that relationship because people hear a lot more on a public radio station like WNYC than just NPR.
And before we get into the coverage and your critique of coverage of ACORN and natural gas drilling proposals in the New York watershed area and some other things, how independent can you be in this role if you work for the network?
Well, it's a great question. You said new, and actually I'm just finished 2 years. I was hired for a 2-year term. It was extended for a year. I would say the learning curve is pretty high in terms of how public radio works, as you just pointed out. So how independent can I be? Well, I have a contract, and that protects me from being fired at will. And I also don't show anything I write. I write a weekly blog at npr.org/ombudsman, and no one from NPR sees that before it goes on my post. No one censors things that I say on the air.
So it's like a bill of attainder kind of protection. Oh, never mind.
Never mind.
And we will talk about NPR coverage of 3 stories that you've been reviewing. And listeners, you can weigh in on those: coverage of ACORN, coverage of the Marcellus Shale and other drilling for natural gas using the new technology called fracking. And we'll talk about how NPR uses social media as well. But you can call in and weigh on those or ask about others at 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692, or post to WNYC.org. Click on Brian Lehrer Show. And on the ACORN controversy, you looked first at some complaints that NPR was slow to get on the story. Days after Fox News was running heavily with it, what did you conclude?
Well, that they work slow, and I think there's a greater problem out there to be dismissive of stories that appear on Fox News by the general media. And that was a good example of that. You could look at it the other way, that maybe there are certain stories that are on Fox that people consider crying wolf. That was definitely a valid story. But to NPR's credit, and that isn't my job to shill for them. I want to make that perfectly clear. But you have to check out those videos. You have to make sure that they are authentic and that what happened in the video did actually happen and it wasn't staged. So that was one reason that NPR said in defending why it hadn't moved faster.
Also, I think you said, and I think you're pretty supportive of NPR on this, and you're going to be more critical on the natural gas story when we get to that, that the videos themselves showing some bad behavior by one organization, a very large organization with many, many employees, that in and of itself doesn't necessarily rise to a news story by NPR standards. Once you had members of Congress debating a cutoff of funding to an organization that Congress has long funded, then it's obviously a story. But where's that line?
Well, that line is when something becomes news, and news is really what people are talking about, which is what is unexpected. And as you said, we tend in the news media to make process news, i.e. the House votes to cut off funding, and that makes it very easy to say, okay, now this is a story.
Jon Stewart did a great piece about how much more coverage the ACORN scandal got than the Blackwater scandal, which was much bigger and cost people's lives and didn't start the same hue and cry in Congress, and certainly not in the media, about cutting off their funding. So are those kinds of comparisons by somebody who is admittedly a comedian useful, in your opinion?
I think they are useful, but they also speak to how the news media works. And what you had with ACORN was videos, and videos that people could see on the web, and versus something that's more complicated, harder to understand in terms of the funding with Blackwater. I mean, that, again, a lot of what I do is explain but not excuse.
And I think a big issue with the ACORN story is context. And so once you're doing the story, yes, the video showed bad behavior, but what percentage of ACORN's operation did that represent? What is ACORN? What was the institution's response to the videos? Why would people be out to sting them in the way the video makers did? Who were their enemies and what was their agenda?
Absolutely.
Context questions like that.
I mean, context is so important to any story that the news media does. But I will say if it could be considered a boon to ACORN, people did start paying more attention to what they do. After I wrote the blog post about ACORN, NPR did 3 stories that focused primarily on the financial difficulties they had, what they do. They spoke with them, people who work for ACORN, people who are recipients of ACORN's work. So that might be the silver lining if there is one.